How to Save Jung from the Red Book and the Red Book from Jung. Thank you everybody for the opportunity to speak here, and especially I want to thank my distinguished fellow panellists, Jean and Tom Kirsch and Susan Thackeray. I'm going to begin by reading a quotation from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in which Jung writes the following about the Red Book. In the Red Book, I tried an aesthetic elaboration of my fantasies, but never finished it. I became aware that I had not yet found the right language, that I still had to translate it into something else. Therefore, I gave up this aestheticizing tendency in good time in favour of a rigorous process of understanding. Okay, as you can see, my title is an attempt to drive a wedge between Jung as the author of the Red Book and the Red Book itself. And this is an unusual approach to such a powerful and intriguing and rich work such as the Red Book. But I want to show how a number of ways of interpreting the Red Book may actually have the effect of limiting its possibilities. And my core argument today is going to be that the Red Book actually invites a much more multiple and plural and open sense of its possibilities, and that the habitual link of Jung, the historical person, as the author of the Red Book may be actually leading us to miss some of its really powerful imaginative qualities. And what is absolutely at the heart of what I'm going to argue today is the kind of paradoxical notion that to be truly Jungian about the Red Book, we need to let go of the link with C.G. Jung himself. And I'm going to explain how that actually might work. So just to kind of restate that, I'm going to suggest that the most Jungian approach to the Red Book is to detach Jung as author and allow the Red Book to demonstrate its own multiple ways into discussing the modern imagination. So let's take a look at where we are now. Within 3 years of the first publication of C.G. Jung's Red Book, Liber Novus, in 2009, we have startlingly diverse opinions published already in the last few years. These opinions range from its editor Sonu Shamdasani's assertion that the Red Book is the single most important documentary source and the key to comprehending the genesis of the collected works, to Jungian analyst Wolfgang Giegerich's indictment that it represents Jung's fabrication of the unconscious. Rather than finding a consensus, first analyses of this hitherto withheld text have been revealing in their differences. There is as yet no broad agreement on the meaning of the Red Book for either Jung's collected works or for the practice of Jungian psychotherapy. And this is clearly a big issue in the Jungian world, if whether or not the Red Book itself should be affecting the way Jungian therapists conduct their work or think about their work. The suggestion of a polarization around the reception of the Red Book is important because of the unusual circumstances of its publication. Such circumstances are in turn compounded by the form of the book not resembling anything else directly published by Jung. Handwritten with original paintings in medieval style, indicating a wide variety of cultural sources, the Red Book was not authorised for publication during Jung's lifetime, unlike everything else that exists today in the collected works. Even Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which came out after Jung died, was a project upon which he collaborated and contributed some significantly written material. And notably, as I quoted at the beginning of this talk, it's in Memories, Dreams, Reflections in which Jung alludes to the Red Book as abandoned due to its unsatisfactory aesthetic form. As a result, the relationship between what Shamdasani aptly calls a work of psychology in literary form and the kind of writing that populates the collected works is open to question. These questions become more insistent when recognising that the Red Book today satisfies no one literary or psychological genre. The Red Book, what I mean here is that the Red Book doesn't fit any categories. It's not like anything else in psychology, it's not like anything else in literature, and there is no kind of direct tradition that would actually account for all the different aspects of the Red Book. So what I'm going to be suggesting is that the Red Book itself embodies a question to the history of the book and of writing itself. I'm going to be suggesting that the Red Book invites rethinking of more than just Jung. The Red Book is an experiment in psychological writing. It's an investigation into the parameters of art, and it even questions the nature of academic disciplines and literary genres. As Sanford L. Drobe remarks in his invaluable Reading the Red Book, an Interpretive Guide to C.G. Jung's Liber Novus, which came out last year, he says, such a multifaceted text invites ongoing and multiple readings. And I want to kind of praise Sanford L. Drobe's book because I think he has a very humane, imaginative attitude to the Red Book, and very much kind of builds on this idea that there isn't going to be one explanation of its depth and complexities, while bringing an important wealth of scholarship to the things that the Red Book is saying. So, one of my aims is to save Jung's plural possibilities of psychological understanding from being curtailed by measuring his later works by singular interpretations of the Red Book. Having saved Jung from punitive readings of the Red Book, I'm going to also look at saving the Red Book from Jung in the sense of having its qualities restricted by constructing Jung as author. Although no one doubts that Jung wrote and painted the Red Book, the notion of author in modernity is a cultural rather than natural one. I'm drawing upon cultural theory such as Rowland Barthes' Death of the Author that was published in 1968. I want to show that the Red Book can be liberated from Jung as an authorizing presence. And I just want to kind of mention here a little bit about this idea of the author, that Rowland Barthes points out that the notion of the writer of a text as the sole source and limit of the meaning of the text, this is a modern notion. When we say, what did Jung really mean by this when reading something in the collected works, we are constructing Jung as a kind of God of the text. And it's a very rational kind of God, because it assumes that it would be possible to ask Jung and he would be able to give us a straightforward, singular meaning of what he really meant by a sequence of words. This is so habitual, what did Jung really mean by this, that it seems like a natural way to read. It's not a natural way to read, it's a cultural way to read. It's a way of reading that has developed in the past 300 years, in particular, at the same time and as part of a kind of a focus on the individual as the meaningful kind of source of knowledge. It's part of individualism that we create authors, meaning authorities behind somebody who writes something down. This is very modern. It is not the way writing has been treated throughout Western modernity. Prior to Romanticism, which was one of the main generators of this idea of the creative author as a kind of God figure, prior to Romanticism, what was important about writing was not the extent to which it was original, but the extent to which it was traditional. And tradition and the interpretation of tradition and drawing upon authorities, this was one of the key modes of reading, a mode of reading that seems strange and limiting to us now. What I find very interesting about Jung and this idea of the death of the author is that I think Jung's sense that the ego needs to be decentered could be argued to be a psychological counterpart to Barth's suggestion that the author as authorizing presence needs to be decentered. That really one of the things that Jung is about is getting rid of the ego masquerading as a god and liberating the imaginative qualities of words, just as he was so dedicated to liberating the imaginative qualities of dream images. Okay, so what I want to do is start by looking at the obviously immediate and most powerful construction of the Red Book in Sonu Shamdasani's introduction, which is extremely interesting and very well argued and very scholarly, and a very valuable piece of work, but I'm suggesting also can be limiting if we think about the imaginative possibilities of both Jung's ultimate psychology and, of course, the Red Book itself. So, Shamdasani points to the epilogue of commentaries within the Red Book itself as showing that the book contains its own self-explication from its author. Liber Novus, as he always refers to the Red Book, needs no additional interpretation since it provides its own. This proposition is more problematic than it might first appear, given that for Shamdasani it substantiates the notion that his own historical approach to the material effectively insulates the Red Book from any further outside analyses. Put another way, Shamdasani's notion of history is both invaluable and irreplaceable in connecting Jung to his time and to his predecessors, and, I shall suggest, perilously limiting when it comes to the implications of Jung's insistence of the primacy of the creative unconscious. For at the heart of Jung's contribution to understanding the human psyche, I argue, is what James Hillman said of Picasso and Wallace Stevens. He said, "They realise that they are imagination before they are history." Shamdasani uses metaphors of the centre and of Genesis to position the Red Book with regard to the collected works. While admitting different form and even differences of content between the Red Book and the collected works, they nevertheless remain conjoined in his analysis. He says, "One is simply not in the position to comprehend the genesis of Jung's late work, nor to fully understand what he was attempting to achieve without studying Liber Novus. At the same time, the collected works can in part be considered an indirect commentary on Liber Novus. Each mutually explicates the other. As the centre of Jung's oeuvre," as the editor's introduction begins, the Red Book was at the centre of Jung's self-experimentation, nothing less than the central book in his oeuvre. So the introduction concludes, its circularity of vocabulary making the point inescapable. In a revealing interview with John Beebe, published in the journal Psychological Perspectives, Shamdasani gives this notion of relentless centrality a human dimension by saying that here Jung becomes Jung. Before the Red Book, Jung's publications show that he could have gone in the direction of comparative mythology, whereas the Red Book contains themes that Jung would elaborate for the rest of his career. It is to John Beebe that Shamdasani explains his notion of history and biography in ways that channel understanding in a very specific direction. Shamdasani says, "I think that the first task of any biography is reconstructing the subject's own self-understanding. That is what I tried to do in my introduction to Liber Novus. That's as far as I think one can go. One can reconstruct someone's self-understanding, how the historical actors perceive their own actions, render the context intelligible and leave it at that, and not fill in the gaps with fantasy and speculation." Beebe's reply to this definition of biography is to gently point out that Jungian analysts, by contrast, like a more liberated notion of interpretation, to which Shamdasani rejoins that interpretation of this kind belongs in a different discipline. The motif of Genesis and centre provides a clue to the narrative by which Shamdasani is conceiving his own discipline. One could go so far to say that Shamdasani is constructing an origin myth out of the Red Book. Alleging that Jung says this work contains the nucleus for his future psychology, Shamdasani positions the Red Book as the originating force, Genesis as a verb. In the three uses of Genesis in his introduction, all are verbs and not of Genesis as text, the first book of the Bible. Genesis is what the Red Book does for the collected works. For that reason, the Red Book is positioned as this primary kind of fertilizing generativity. In effect, Shamdasani's Liber Novus is a gateway to Jung as the authorizing father god of his psychology and writing. Just as Wolfgang Gigerich, with very different motives, ascribes a Bible fantasy to Jung's use of the term new book, Liber Novus, so to Shamdasani, the Red Book is the Bible, Liber Novus, to a significantly worded project of understanding the collected works. To Shamdasani, Liber Novus means new Bible, one that can provide an authorizing presence of Jung in his conventionally published work. The Red Book as this type of Bible, conceived as a record of a Genesis-type creation of Jung's world, has implicit and important ideas for knowledge. For by suggesting that historical biography should aim for the self-understanding of the subject, the way Shamdasani frames the Red Book as Bible to Jung suggests that such knowledge is possible. To Shamdasani, the Red Book can supply crucial parts of Jung's self-understanding, especially when read as providing what is missing from the collected works and vice versa. Such an idea implies far more than historical figures possess a notion of their personal and intellectual identity. For the notion of a reconstructible self-understanding relies upon the idea of a coherent, stable self, and that such a self is to be found in writing. Even the term primary documentation suggests that meaning in words is fundamentally fixed, can be ascertained by reconstructing historical and biographical context, and crucially has a subsequent stabilising force on writing that is done later. Primary documents are the material witness to the genesis effect of the Red Book on the collected works. Therefore, they must themselves be read as vehicles of a stable truth of self, incarnated in language, with a secure and comprehensible and consistent meaning.
What I'm suggesting is that in the introduction that to the Red Book by Sonu Shamdasani is that he's constructing a myth of Jung as a kind of omniscient, ego-based, understanding-based, rational-based father god of the collected works. And he's positing a relationship between the Red Book and the collected works where they're going to mutually guarantee each other. And that what this does is it constructs Jung as a kind of authorizing presence. And this has a real effect on the way he's constructing the imaginative qualities of the writing. Such an idea of the Red Book supplying crucial parts of Jung's self-understanding implies far more than that historical figures possess a notion of their personal and intellectual identity. For the notion of a reconstructible self-understanding relies upon the idea of a coherent, stable self, and such a self is to be found in writing. Let me put this another way. Don't worry about the screen. It has nothing to do with what I'm actually saying. I mean, even if it was working, it would have nothing to do. That's separate. What I'm saying is that I think there's basically two attitudes to meaning of words. One is that the meaning of words is basically stable, and the other attitude is that the meanings of words is basically unstable. Now, Sonu Shamdasani is working with the idea that the meaning of words is basically stable, which actually means an idea of the self, the psyche, as basically stable. If you believe in a radically unstable psyche, or shall we say a psyche in which the imagination is the most important thing about it, then you're also going to see language as very imaginative and the meanings of words as not basically stable. I think Jung is on the unstable side of the meaning of words, because for him the imagination is more important than the ego. The power of the unconscious to destabilize the ego is more important than the power of the ego to promote rational understanding. So I think Shamdasani's understanding of the Red Book is coming from the dominant understanding of modernity that privileges the ego, that privileges rationality, and makes of the author a stabilizing figure on meaning, that makes the author an understandable figure and whose power is constructed so as to stabilize the meaning of the text. I think this is why Shamdasani is so keen that people don't interpret the Red Book, because he wants the imagination to be kept at bay, and we should be privileging our kind of rational understanding of the words of the Red Book. Given the different voices that we've experienced so far this morning, I'm proposing that Shamdasani's invaluable work and in many ways wonderful work of editing, that it's not the only way we want to look at the Red Book. And I think the fact that his construction of Jung is coming out of the mainstream of modernity with the idea of the stable self and the stable meanings of words, the fact that this is not primarily Jung's construction of the psyche is something that we could talk about and bear in mind. A couple more things, and then I'm going to move off Shamdasani's introduction. The way he describes the writing is very significant. He talks about the Red Book as primary documents. He wants the Red Book to be a historical document where history isn't going to let in the unconscious in any way. He also insists that the Red Book isn't experimental writing, it is rather the record of scientific experiments. It's a record, it's not in itself an experiment with images in writing. Now, one issue that we might recall here is that, as I quoted at the beginning from Memory Street's Reflections, in Memory Street's Reflections, Jung records that he's unhappy with the Red Book and that he leaves it, he doesn't pursue it, he doesn't finish it, and we know that he didn't publish it in his own lifetime. The whole question of whether or not the Red Book should have been published is a really interesting question. I just want to point out that if Shamdasani is arguing that Jung is the father god of the text, if the god changed his mind about the Red Book, then that is also something that kind of exposes the possibility of other ways of looking at the work itself. If you make a god, it matters if the god proves capricious. And finally, Shamdasani takes the wholly modern view that you can separate the meaningful content of writing with its aesthetic, artistic qualities. But that's not Jung's view on language throughout the collected works, I would argue. I'm just going to read a brief quotation from Aeon, where Jung writes, "Therefore, in describing the living processes of the psyche, I deliberately and consciously give preference to a dramatic, mythological way of thinking and speaking, because this is not only more expressive, but also more exact than an abstract scientific terminology, which is wont to toy with the notion that its theoretic formulations may one fine day be resolved into algebraic equations." What I think is fascinating there is when Jung says that dramatic, mythological ways of writing are more exact. You know, they're not decorations for conceptual language. Conceptual language, which is by its very nature rational, conceptual language is ego language. And Jung says elsewhere, you have to have concepts, you have to be scientific, but let's not imagine that's where the psyche is most powerful. The psyche is most powerful in its mysterious nature, and the artistic language, the dramatic, mythological, poetic language is more exact. So I want to turn briefly to Wolfgang Gigerich's long, very scholarly, very well argued review of the Red Book that was published in spring. Fascinatingly, his view is very, very similar to Sonu Shamdasani's view of the Red Book, but he draws very different conclusions from it. Gigerich agrees with Shamdasani that there is that the Red Book has a kind of historical relevance, but he regards it as an attempt to fabricate, and fabricate is a quotation, fabricate the unconscious. And his review of the Red Book is a series of assaults on it. The first one is where he says that the Red Book is not a book at all. Although Jung's copy of the Red Book is physically a book, the Red Book is not a book in the sense of being written for and communicating to a public. Here, Gigerich is implying more than disagreeing with Shamdasani on Jung's hope for publication. He's denying value to the reception of the book. He calls its style contraceptive, in a startling reversal of Shamdasani's Genesis myth. The Red Book is an impossible book because its prophetic tone insulates it from a general audience. Next, Gigerich demolishes the objection to his portrayal of the Red Book as insufficiently wrought to communicate to his readers by denying it the status of art. If the Red Book were to be considered a work of art, then the peculiarity of the words and paintings might be attributable to a uniqueness that was its justification rather than its disqualification. Unfortunately for the Red Book, Gigerich draws on the philosopher Hegel to deny that possibility. He says that a work of art must figure its own origin, be aesthetically and formally self-sufficient. By contrast, the Red Book is tethered to Jung's own fantasy world. It neither seeks nor achieves the status of works that could be compared to it, such as Dante's Divine Comedy. So it's not a book because it's not designed to communicate to an audience, and it's not art because it's too personal. It's too much drawing on Jung's own psyche. This is Gigerich's view. He then says that what's happening in the Red Book is that the unconscious is being made up, is being falsified, or in the word that he uses, fabricated. And he makes a very revealing statement about the unconscious as an important source of meaning and truth for Jung. This is Gigerich. The new locus of truth that was needed could not simply be discovered and made use of by Jung, the way America was discovered and then settled by millions of Europeans. He had to fabricate it, and fabricate it as he was making use of it. So, Gigerich is saying, on the one hand, America was discovered by Europeans, and Jung seems to think that he's doing a similar thing, but he's not. The unconscious is not a land to be discovered. Now, this is a very revealing statement. It's very old-fashioned to talk about America being discovered by Europeans. As I think we're all aware, America had a complex civilization prior to the arrival of European settlers. This attitude, this very colonial attitude to knowledge, is symptomatic of Gigerich's standpoint, which is that Western modernity is correct, that the stress on the tradition of rationality and the stable self and what he, of course, he memorably calls the soul's logical life, that this is the truth. To Gigerich, the unconscious exists, but it has no meaning. It exists so unmeaningfully that it doesn't really have an ontology. It's not important enough to be counted as real in any significant way. This is why I'm saying that Gigerich is very like Sonu Shamdasani. To both of them, the ego and rational understandings of the psyche are the important ones. Sonu Shamdasani sees such a possibility in the Red Book. Wolfgang Gigerich is denying such a possibility in the Red Book, but they both have a very similar construction of knowledge. And I think in both cases they're not Jungian in the sense of what I would argue is very fundamental to Jung, and that is his sense of the importance of the other as just absolutely undeniable and overwhelming and a starting point. In my view, the aspect of Jung's work that is irrefutable and fundamental is him saying that if we accept that the unconscious exists, then we must accept that all that we think we know is provisional, that it undermines certainty. And if it undermines certainty, then it undermines a stable self, it undermines stable meanings in words. And it means that we must accept that there may be other sources of knowledge than the sources of knowledge that we are most familiar with and we are most comfortable with, that make up our world of the ego. So my making a big fuss about this single word discovered in Gigerich's assault on the Red Book, and I am making a big fuss. It's a very minor word in a long argument, but it's revealing of this sense that only the kind of Western modernity has a kind of source of knowledge that is important. There is no other in any meaningful sense. There is no other to the making of the stable self, the making of the ego, the making of Western modernity. The fact that there were indigenous cultures who saw things very differently in the land that we now call the United States is irrelevant, because the other is irrelevant, because the unconscious is irrelevant. And near the end of his piece, he says a very similar thing when talking about dreams. So let me try and sum up what I'm saying about Gigerich's work, and then I'm going to move on, and then there will be a few minutes for beginnings of questions and responses before we take a break. So to sum up, Gigerich is not denying the unconscious as an aspect of the human psyche. He's denying it the status ascribed to it by Jung, for example here in the Red Book. To Jung, dreams are real in a way external to the ego. They are evidence of an autonomous part of the psyche, an independent and natural activity. Images outside the control of the ego in dreams and active imagination are nature. They are where human nature becomes impossible to differentiate from non-human nature. For Gigerich, dreams are not nature. While being outside ego control, they are nevertheless dynamic parts of a psyche that wants to become integrated as logical thought. Dreams are my own thoughts produced by me, only by me. They are thoughts and not events of nature. That's Gigerich speaking. Here we see Gigerich's assertion of the human psyche as fundamentally separate from the external world. Unlike Jung, nature is not an other that is a productive contributor to making meaning, whether nature is the human unconscious or the planet that houses it. One of the things I've become interested in recently is the way in which Jung's work leads into a kind of ecology, leads into seeing us as part of the natural world in ways that I think are very important for today. Gigerich is very specifically saying that we can't do that, that nature is no longer real to us, and that we've lost that contact and we're not going to get it back. I want to look at some of the other readings of the Red Book that have looked at it as a religious work, as a work of psychology, contributing to psychology, and briefly as a work of literature and as a work of history. I've looked at the work of three Jungian scholars, who have looked at the religious content of the Red Book. They are Anne Belford Ulanov, Lionel Corbett, and Walter O'Daniek. Anne Ulanov's essay in Quadrant is fascinating. She calls the Red Book an source. And I want to make the point that an source is not the same kind of primary document that Shamdasani is talking about. An source contains much more of the unconscious than a primary document ever could, and allows a lot more sense of the unconscious as being part of the making of meaning. An source is never a straightforward prior text. Previously hidden, while it possesses a generative genesis property, it's one subject to scholarly debate. An source will not wholly authenticate or stabilize the meaning of another piece of writing, such as Jung's collected works. Consequently, Ulanov's genesis myth of the Red Book is far less singular than is that of Shamdasani. In an source, there's a notion of historical understanding as containing a good deal of what is not subject to conscious knowing, because so much that is relevant is not recorded. Source gives history an unconscious. It's a disciplinary unconscious with a Jungian twist, in that it leaves space for other fruitful arguments to flourish. Ulanov's main point is that the Red Book is devoted to changing the location of God, what I'm going to call later a replacing of God. God is no longer transcendent, but must become immanent within human beings. And I think it's a very powerful understanding. Lionel Corbett's work on the Red Book is interestingly devoted to that interesting boundary that we have in Jungian studies between psychology and religion. Whether it comes up in Jungians being accused of being too religious, or whether it comes up in the way in which religious people are drawn to Jungian ideas, because it seems to offer them a kind of freedom, a way of being religious that is no longer possible within the kinds of religious cultures they grew up in. But the whole question of the psyche and its religious nature is clearly something that is very endemic to Jung's work, and certainly is present in the Red Book, as we've seen this morning. I want to just say something briefly about Walter O'Daniek's work, partly because I've had the privilege of seeing a second essay that he's written on the Red Book that has not yet been published, that will be published in Psychological Perspectives very shortly. One has been published, one is yet to be published. And he's doing something that is both like and unlike Sonu Shamdasani's work. It's like it. Walter O'Daniek, I will spell his surname, O-D-A-N-Y-C-K, I could be wrong. Ask me later. Yeah, lose the C. He sees a link between the Red Book and the work, Jung's work on typology. And which is similar to the way Sonu Shamdasani is trying to make the Red Book and the collected works into kind of mutually guaranteeing forces. But Walter's work is devoted to enabling a new kind of imaginative understanding of differences. He sees the typology, the possibilities of Jung's work on typology as essential if we're to start to get to grips with some of the very divisive forces that we face in the 21st century. Odanic says this: all religious, ideological, national, ethnic, political and cultural disputes are at the heart externalizations of conflicting forces within our individual and collective psyche. He talks about the dispute between Freud and Jung as being typologically driven. This fundamentally contrary position to that of Giegerich is revealing. Less obvious is the way Odanic echoes Shamdasani in regarding the Red Book as a source for ideas in the collected works, while transforming the implications of a source from historical verification to participating in the crisis of the 21st century. Saving the world cannot happen by telling people what to do, Odanic suggests. It can only come about by a collective change that responds to an inner transformation in enough of the human souls on the planet. In offering the Red Book as a potential catalyst for just such a new consciousness, Odanic is proposing that changing God in the Red Book changes both Jungian psychology and its afflicted subject, human psychology. I don't think I'll spend too much time on the psychological readings of the Red Book, but I would like to just quote from Sanford L. Drobe's Reading the Red Book, because I think it's going to be incredibly useful and important as we continue to work with the Red Book in the next few years. As I said before, he makes a point of offering multiple perspectives on the Red Book, of not limiting interpretations. In a fascinating final section of his book, he considers the Red Book as a dream, but not the dream of one person, the dream of a discipline, the dream of psychology itself. Crucially, he offers the Red Book as a compensatory dream, one that implicitly challenges and augments the biases of psychology, trying to squeeze into the confines of rational cognition. Drobe's point is that the Red Book shows us what's been left out of mainstream psychology, the psychology that tries to deal with the psyche in exclusively rational ways. Drobe says, psychology has essentially become separated from its philosophical, literary and theological roots and has carried itself out as a specialized science with clear boundaries from other social sciences and much sharper ones from the humanities and such disciplines as anthropology and history. What Jung in the Red Book referred to as the spirit of this time, the scientific hyper-rational mode of thinking, is, within the discipline of psychology, gaining a stranglehold on the academy and profession. And he says that the Red Book shows this. This not only means that psychology should reopen its boundaries to other disciplines, including those that are artistic and literary, but that it should also consider the possibility that things of great psychological significance can be better or only expressed in modalities such as music, art and literature that are neither scientific nor rational in the narrow sense of the term. Now, I think that Drobe has got something really important about the Red Book, that it challenges our ability to talk of things like psychology and art, rational and irrational, aesthetic and scientific, religious and psychological. It challenges our ability to keep these terms separate. And in a way, why I'm so critical of the work of Sonu Shamdasani and Wolfgang Giegerich is that they're trying to reinforce the separation. They're trying to make it history in a very rational sense that gets rid of the psyche, apart from the ego, or trying to make it a psychology that is very much to do with the rational part of the psyche and devalues everything that is other. I think I just want to mention one more view of the Red Book, and then there'll be just a few minutes for questions, and then we'll take a break. And one of the most inspiring things that I read on the Red Book was John Beebe's paper in Quadrant, in which he names the Red Book as a work of conscience. And what I thought was particularly exciting was the way in which John Beebe showed the personal and the collective being intertwined inextricably in the Red Book, so that in the death of Siegfried in the Red Book, you can see a lot that is personal. You can see perhaps aspects of Jung's sorrow and the need to kill, the heroic attitude, what has happened to the heroic attitude in the quarrel with Sigmund Freud, and the need to kill off or to show that the sonship to Freud is over. But that this idea of killing the heroic attitude isn't limited to a very personal or a very ego understanding of what a person is, but is also a kind of collective expression, an expression of the collective psyche, of the particular crisis of the time, which was the First World War, which was the death of millions of young men in the trenches. And these young men went out to die as heroes. It was the spirit of the times that called upon the young men of Europe and later of America to go over in a kind of heroic sense of warriors and a tragic sense that when these young men went out into the trenches, what they found was not a kind of warrior identity and a kind of heroic and noble death, but they found machines, barbed wire, mud, and slaughter. And that this terrible catastrophe is part of the texture and the images of things that are going on in the Red Book. So in this sense, we have a sense of the Red Book as historical, in a sense that Shamdasani doesn't explore, a sense of a kind of collective, imaginative registering of what is going on at the time, in which the individual is not separate from, in which an individual like Jung, who was not taking part in the war, who had no kind of personal connection to the war, but who was also part of that psyche, part of that time, and the spirit of the depths was drawing him into allowing those images to come across. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to invite any questions or comments from the floor for a few minutes. We're then going to take a break, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the Red Book as modernist literature. I'm going to offer some thoughts of my own about ways of working with the Red Book. But can I invite any questions or comments? Yes, sir. Well, I think, yes, sorry, I need to repeat the question. Is the Red Book a kind of atomic bomb to modern psychology? I think a lot of modern psychologists haven't noticed the bomb going off. So in a way, it's a bomb if we make it a bomb. If enough people say that this is important to psychology, because it's showing that the psyche can't only be dealt with in rational, scientific, conceptual terms. If the psychology establishment ignores the Red Book, then it's a very silent bomb indeed, and maybe it will go off at a later date. But thank you for the question. Yes.
When you were speaking of Walter Odaniak,
Yes.
and his linking the typologies that Jung developed, you went on to talk about these inner conflicting forces that I think you that are, it seems to me, are very central.
Yes.
To, and that the I mean, I'm just thinking about today, you know, and all these attempts, whether it's through interfaith work to bring people together. And you talked about the only hope, his saying, I think it's his, Walter, that the only hope is in developing a new consciousness which will transform us. Does he see education in any role, or what does he see as possibilities for bringing people together and fostering this consciousness?
Thank you very much. The question was, in the work of Walter Odaniak, looking at the existence of very deep-rooted conflicts. What are the possibilities for overcoming these conflicts? In the work of his that I've read, he sees typology and the transcendent function, and he sees the idea of the transcendent function as embryonic or part of where the Red Book is going. He sees these ideas as really helpful because so many of our conflicts today are so deeply rooted. It seems to be impossible to get people to listen to each other and to understand where other people are coming from. And he sees typology as a way of understanding why it is people can't hear each other. So I think he sees that education, particularly a kind of psychologically aware education, as having real possibilities in helping people overcome such deep-rooted antagonisms so that they cannot hear each other. I think I'd like to link that with the readings that we did earlier, because we looked at these voices in the Red Book, and the voices were coming from very different places. In particularly with Istubar, the kind of the man of the pagan world, and Jung, or the I voice, talking about modern science and how disastrous their relationship was. Istubar, you know, ends up nearly dying, and yet the story goes on and it doesn't end there. So I think that might be an example of the kind of hope that Walter is pointing to. Thank you. I think we'd have time for one more, if anyone else wants to make a point or ask a question. Yes?
Just because I haven't cracked the cover on the Red Book, I feel I came in with a completely open mind, and I'm listening very, very carefully to both the readings and the questions and the information coming towards us. And I wonder if part of what's really at the core is captured not only in the criticism of the Red Book, but also there's insufficiency even from the reading. There's something missing, the gap, the hole in our own psyches that are being brought to light. And I wonder if you could comment on that. And both your awareness of any criticism, and deepest of stuff seems to, though it sounds so negative, listening to it, it sounds like it's the unconscious. Insufficient. There's not enough. Something's wrong. And then the ego comes along and makes that why that.
That's a really interesting point, which is that there is an insufficiency, and an insufficiency in us that the Red Book seems to be bringing to light by its extraordinariness. how unconventional it is, how it's refusing to fit into our established forms, a hole or a gap. I think the Red Book itself can be said to be full of gaps because it doesn't make sense of itself. There are times when opposites are brought together, and you can argue for a transcendent function if you want to use that kind of language, but it doesn't solve all the, it doesn't tame all the powers it summons. And I think that's, that very much points to things we don't want to notice in our everyday lives. We don't want to notice how we live amongst a world that is full of these incommensurables, of quarrels and conflicts. The Red Book is very stark in exploring human violence and darkness and attraction to it, and but nevertheless does offer a way through these things. So yes, I think the Red Book is telling us about what we need to learn. It's not itself just offering us solutions on a plate. Like all of Jung's writing, I think, it's a performance of the psyche rather than a description of it from the outside. We're going to take a break for 20 minutes, and I want to thank you very much for your attention. I think in starting again, I want to pay tribute to my students at Pacifica Graduate Institute, particularly those on the hybrid Jungian archetypal studies program, because a lot of the work that I'm presenting to you today comes from a course that I teach on that program on the Red Book and active imagination. And it was in preparing the course and discussing these matters with my students that it seemed to me that this idea of the different ways in which the Red Book was being constructed, that there was so much here that could do with some analysis and discussion. So I want to turn to the idea of the Red Book as literature, specifically as modernist literature. And I'm drawing on the work of Matthew V. Spano, and he wrote on the C.G. Jung page, Modernist Man in Search of a Soul, Jung's Red Book as Modernist Visionary Literature. And he points out that the Red Book contains many of the defining characteristics of modernist art. Modernist art, of course, not confined to writing, but also in painting, sculpturing, and literature, poetry. Modernist art in its themes of uncertainty, its structuring around a quest for meaning and soul, its existential angst and fascination with myth. And I think many of us have noticed that the Red Book is like things that we are happy to call art, that seem to be defining themselves in the category of art. I'm thinking of things like T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland, which it so resembles the Red Book in many ways, with its sense of the spirit of the times as being a spirit of wasteland, a kind of psychic wasteland, and in the use of myth. I also, in the course I teach, as well as getting students to read The Wasteland alongside the Red Book, we also look at some of the poetry of W.B. Yeats. And I'm thinking of his poem The Second Coming, which speaks of a rough beast stumbling towards Bethlehem to be born, a sense of Christianity in a state of crisis, and the possibility of violence that isn't being yet dealt with. So Spano's argument about the Red Book as a work of art has a lot going for it. But I want to press this a little further about what it means in the context of the way the Red Book has been received if we start calling it a work of art. So what Spano does is he uses Jung's own division of art into psychological. Jung, of course, with his liking for two categories and opposites, he has two categories for art: psychological and visionary. Psychological art is where the artist has done the psychology. Psychological art is mainly exploring the collective consciousness. It's about things that are known about the world. The psychology has been incorporated very deliberately and overtly by the artist. Jung, unsurprisingly, was more interested in his second category of art, the visionary. Visionary art is where the artist doesn't know what he's doing. And this, of course, speaks to what I was talking about earlier in terms of why we might want to get away from an author-centered, what did Jung really mean in terms of the Red Book. Because visionary art, the author hasn't got a clue what he meant by the art. This is art where the collective unconscious surges through the body of the artist, and art kind of is made in a sense of unknowing and mystery, and in some cases the numinous. So Spano's argument is that this visionary category of art fits the Red Book. He focuses his concepts, his idea of the Red Book, on its editor's insistence of it as text composed via the Jungian technique of active imagination. So both Spano and Shamdasani look at this idea look at active imagination as the main method by which the Red Book was composed. As you all know, active imagination is where images are allowed to come alive of themselves. The ego takes a back seat and it lets the image speak, and then maybe starts to have a dialogue with the image, possibly dialogues similar to the ones we heard earlier today. So Matthew Spano explicitly adheres to Shamdasani's notion of the Red Book as the primary source, cause and progenitor of Jung's theories, while less overtly departing from the editor's refusal to sanction any other disciplinary framework as equally viable. For in suggesting literary value for the Red Book, Spano is going further than Shamdasani's work of psychology in literary form. I think you can hear the difference. Is it a work of psychology in literary form, or is it a work of modernist literature? These two categories have huge implications of how we would then understand the Red Book. Spano is instead proposing that although both Jung and after him Shamdasani define active imagination as a means of psychotherapy, not art making, one might choose to consider the Red Book as art. Now this actually brings up a big issue, and that is the relationship of active imagination to art. And Jung is insistent in various places that active imagination is nature, not art. And here I'm explicitly drawing upon the very famous bit in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, when he hears the voice, a woman's voice, and this is where the idea of the anima starts to be generated. He hears this woman's voice and he says, "What am I doing? It doesn't seem to be science." And the woman's voice says, "It's art." And Jung says, "No, it's not art." And he continues to insist that active imagination is not art. Spano's point here is, well, maybe Jung's wrong, maybe it is art, and therefore maybe the Red Book is a work of art. So Spano's conceptual move here, changing the category from psychology to art, which I personally like, is not spelled out as the disciplinary transition it actually is. whereas many historians and psychologists instinctively regard Jung as the best arbiter of what the Red Book is, Spano is making use of what is tempting to call at this point depth psychology's evil twin, literary studies, in which literature is its own justification. The author cannot limit, just as he or she cannot know, the meaning and ultimate nature of the work. So I want to say just a little something about this, because it's part of what I'm currently working on, and that is the relationship between Jungian psychology in the early years and literary studies in its early years. You may or may not be aware that although literature was studied in universities for centuries and centuries, it was not literature in the language of the people. It was Latin and Greek literature. The study of literature in our own language, rather interestingly, comes about at almost exactly the same time that Jungian and Freudian psychology begin. There's something going on at the end of the 19th century, and various new things are getting going. One of them could be called modernism, and this extends to science as well as to the arts. When we think of things like relativity and quantum physics, clearly the invention of psychology as a discipline and the development of the depth psychologies where the unconscious is particularly important, this is going on. In the broader culture, we have the invention of what I regard as a key cultural figure, and that is the literary detective. Sherlock Holmes is a very powerful, imaginative figure, and it's not a coincidence that the literary detective is a kind of psychoanalyst, a kind of searching for clues and testing out of knowledge. And at the same time, it is decided that universities will offer degrees in the literature of the people. Partly, this degree is an invention because there's a rather unfortunate development in universities at this period. It is that they have to take in people banging at the doors, women. Women get led into universities at the end of the 19th century. It takes them a little longer to have their degrees recognised. But it was considered that the traditional subjects were too hard for women, and therefore something easier needed to be invented, and therefore they invented literary studies. And as you can imagine, if a degree subject comes about from such a with such a kind of cultural history around it, it's going to have an inferiority complex. And literary studies, even today, I think, suffers from a disciplinary inferiority complex. And for this reason, there's been attempt after attempt to find a theory that will prove that the study of literature is capable of generating knowledge. In the early days, the theory that I'm particularly interested in, which is contemporary to Jung, the theory was called New Criticism. And one of its theoretical standpoints is that literature is its own ontology. Literature has a reality so powerful that you can generate genuine knowledge from literature. Now, you may think I've gone crazy and lost the subject of Jung, but I haven't, because in 1916, Jung made some of the early publications on active imagination. And as we know, active imagination is about allowing the images to come alive, and that itself becomes a method of psychotherapy, but also a method of generating psychological knowledge. In 1911 was published a book by a literary studies person, I.A. Richards, called Practical Criticism, in which he proposed a new method of reading, a method of reading in which literature would be regarded as more real than the ego, in which the literature reading literature very intensely, very closely, ignoring the ego, ignoring the author, but just allowing the literature to have its own reality, that this would generate knowledge. At the time, this practice of reading was called textual criticism or practical criticism. Today, it's called close reading. It's the only research method invented by literary studies. Literary studies uses a number of research methods. They're taken from a number of disciplines. This is the one it invented, and it's almost identical to active imagination. Close reading means taking the words as images that have their own reality, that must be adhered to, that must be followed, that must be allowed to guide. In close reading, in literary close reading, you have to allow the words as images to come alive, and it's not about your own personal understanding of the poem or the play or the novel. It's about where those images are taking you. I think that something happened at this moment in the early 20th century in these two areas, both descended from Romanticism. Literary studies ideas were descended from Romanticism. So, of course, we know were Freud and Jung in particular from Romantic philosophy. Romantic philosophy was about the reality of the creative imagination. And in that sense, was one of the ancestors of psychoanalysis and analytical psychology. And I think that there's a kind of relationship between active imagination, in which there is a denial of art, and close reading, in which there is a denial of psyche. Literary studies liked to pretend that the psyche wasn't really a factor. Liked to pretend that the psyche wasn't really a factor. And Jung was very insistent that art wasn't really a factor in active imagination. Literary studies repressed nature, the nature of the psyche, and I think Jung was repressing art. And I think perhaps the time has come where we could allow a kind of reciprocal exchange between close reading, accepting the nature of the psyche that reads by privileging the other, and active imagination, that could be called an art, in the sense that it's something that's very hard to do. You have to learn it. It's some people have an affinity for active imagination, and some people find it extremely difficult. So it's an art in the sense that you have to learn it, you have to study it, you have to kind of be in a kind of apprentice. I think it's a very shamanistic type of practice. If you are in the literary field, close reading is something you are taught, and you practice it for years. I'm a better close reader today after having practiced it for 30 years than I was when I was an undergraduate. And I think that really we're talking about certain psychological arts in both cases. So what I'm saying, to come back to the topic of today and the Red Book, is that calling the Red Book art is extremely productive and quite radical. But maybe we're moving on to something where we would question these different divisions between art and psychology and history and theology. So finally, in this section, I'm going to talk about the frame and the field. Because I think I'm going to draw on the philosopher Jacques Derrida in acknowledging that what happens with all these different approaches to the Red Book is that each approach is a kind of frame. It's a kind of frame in the way you put a frame around a picture. So you put a frame when you call the Red Book psychology, and you put a different frame when you call it art. And you put a different frame in our world today when you call it theology. But it's a frame in two senses. It's a frame that defines the book in a certain way, but it also kind of frames it in the sense that the inevitability of the frame is also really you're adding something to the book itself. The Red Book, which we can see as a physical object, and we imagine that all physical objects are separate, but really that's not the case. That every time we write about the Red Book, or even every time we read the Red Book, we are bringing something to it. At no point does anybody come to the Red Book innocent. We're always bringing some kind of frame, some kind of education that we've had, some kind of something that we are looking for, some kind of agenda. We have an agenda even when we don't have an agenda, because if we don't have an agenda that we're conscious of, we have an agenda that we're unconscious of because we've been trained as a Jungian analyst, or we've been trained as a literary scholar, or we've been trained as a theologian, or we are a certain kind of historian. So we always have an agenda that actually distorts the text that we are addressing. By marking off space into different qualities of art and not art, the frame instates a whole series of orderings between interior and exterior, outer and inner, above and below. Importantly, not all frames are made of wood or cardboard. Rather, each of the readings considered above are in their own way framing the Red Book. Literally coming between the reader and the text, Shamdasani's introduction places the Red Book in a mythical narrative of Genesis and the manifestation of a unique individual with a distinct set of ideas. So, in the actual Red Book, as it's presented to us in both of its publications, we literally come to it through the introduction, which itself is setting up a frame, a mythical structure by which we're invited to read the Red Book. In particular, Shamdasani's frame that the Red Book is the single most important documentary source is a peculiarly apt example of instating what Derrida calls meaning as presence. By collapsing the historical personage Jung, who had some intangible personal psychic experiences, into the writing that he did referring to these events, Shamdasani is relying upon an ancient notion of meaning in words as stabilized by their author. Inherent in ancient Greek dualism is the idea of speaking as more authentic than writing because of the presence of the author. By contrast, Derrida proclaims the reverse way of doing things, that writing is more valuable than speech because it does not pretend to an authorizing presence that is illusory, since speech rather depends upon writing, upon the properties of the language system to signify. Okay, I'm not going to go on about Derrida, but I've argued several times that actually Jung and Derrida are not entirely different, that in many ways Jung anticipates what has come to be called deconstruction. Deconstruction really means showing something, making and unmaking at the same time. Individuation is deconstruction of the psyche, because in individuation, when the ego is challenged by the other parts of the psyche, our certainty is taken away. We are deconstructed. We are both constructed by individuation, and our certainties are taken away. We are both taken apart and made again. So the frame seems to be saying, the idea of the frame seems to add up to the idea that we can't ever have a true understanding of the Red Book, because at no point are we objective. We're not objective because we're always caught up in our education, in the type of culture we have. The word discourse is often used of this. We're caught up with the discourses of our own society, so there is no kind of objective reading of the Red Book. This itself is part of, I think, newer understandings of the question of subjectivity and objectivity, by which the frame needs to give way to a better word, and the better word I suggest is the field. So we're talking about field theory, and in field theory we no longer consider ourselves as isolated subjects. We are at every point caught up with the processes of the world, and in particular our unconscious is not separate from the world, but is imbued in the world. For those of you who are therapists and analysts, you know that when you are with a patient, a client, you are in a field with that person. There is something between you that is real and is not about you two as separate people. You are caught up in a mutually implicating reality. Well, this can be extended to reading. I've just argued that by active imagination or close reading, we are entering a kind of field where the unconscious, with its meaningfulness, with its archetypes, is going to be part of the constructing, the experiencing, that bodily as well as psychic experience of reading something like the Red Book. So I'm suggesting that Derrida's notion of language as a flickering field that makes up what we can call reality effectively resembles Jung's overall vision of a psyche as that which envelops and frames our reality. The psyche frames reality because it produces our sense of the world through processes we call conscious and unconscious. These processes are structured by what literary theory would call discourses and Jung would call myths. These latter narratives are ways that body and psyche together interact dynamically with and by constituting what appears as real. For although Jung theorized the existence of inherited potential structuring principles called archetypes, these have a somatic dimension and a dialogical relationship with the collective in constituting language and signifying. Okay, so I'm going to move on to an attempt to offer some ideas on the Red Book that try to kind of be true to this idea of the field. And I'm going to start with something very straightforward, and that is that the Red Book itself offers a genre which is not exactly what the Red Book is. I said earlier that it doesn't fit any one existing genre, but twice in the Red Book we find the mention of mystery plays. And I quote from the Red Book: "The scene of the mystery play is a deep place like the center of a volcano." Mystery plays are not at all like the Red Book in many ways. Mystery plays are plays that were composed in the medieval period. They took stories of the Bible, and at Easter time in various parts of Europe, these stories would be dramatically enacted by the people. The mystery plays were crucially in the language of the people. They took the stories of the Bible and in many cases would take the whole Bible, and there would be a cycle of mystery plays, sometimes as many as 30 plays, and these would be performed by working people during Easter festivals. So the fact that it was Easter meant that they had a holy day, as in holiday, and the holiday was celebrated in a religious sense by the performance of these mystery plays. Mystery plays were not written by any one person. There are no authors of mystery plays. They were almost certainly collectively composed and changed perhaps every time they were performed. There would be jokes, there would be extra characters, there would be clowning, but also there would be the sacred language and the sacred stories. So they were themselves a very heterogeneous mixture of popular, embodied forms performed by the people at the very bottom of society, but they were connecting with the very top of society in the sense that they were performing something that was part of their religion. And I think at this point we can start to see some resemblance between the Red Book and mystery plays in the sense of the way in which the Red Book is trying to connect the depths with the so-called heights, trying to connect the transcendent experience, or rather re-embody the experience of the divine. And explicitly in the Red Book, we get the I figure having a dialogue with one of the lowly. And that one of the lowly is, first of all, the tramp who is enamored of the cinema and who dies rather sadly and leaves the I figure with blood all over his hands. And what the I figure says is that this lowly figure is taking him further down into the depths. And the other lower class figure whom I'm very fond of in the Red Book is the fat cook, because she's a woman, she's not evil, and it seems that there is a kind of sense of the I figure needing to come to terms with people like the fat cook and what she's actually doing in the play. So, mystery plays. There's another sense that I'm going to try and embody this idea of the field, which is the term dialogical. In one of my previous books, I talked about the way in which Jung's ideas of the psyche very closely resemble the literary theorist's idea of the dialogical imagination. And this literary theorist is called Bakhtin. His work was only available in English in 1981. He was in, at the same time Jung was writing some of the major collective works, Bakhtin was working in Russia. I don't think there is any direct link between them at all. But what Bakhtin says about language corresponds pretty well to what Jung says about the psyche. Bakhtin says that language is dialogical in the sense that it only exists when it's being used, and when it's being used in society, there is an implicit tension between power, which tends to standardize language, and our own individual expressions of our being, which tends to unstandardize language. We all have to use the same language because we're all affected by power. But we use language slightly differently because of our individual psyches. So there's this constant tension between power concentrating meaning and individual use diluting meaning. Now, really, if you're going to believe that about language, if you're going to have a dialogical language, then you really need to have a dialogical psyche. So in order to understand this notion of the concentration of meaning, you need some kind of idea which we might just for once call archetype. Archetypes are, have a quality, if they are as Jung suggested, then they're going to have a quality of drawing meaning to themselves, of condensing meaning. But we know that archetypes never appear as pure archetypes. They always appear as archetypal images, and archetypal images are affected by the individual instance. So archetypal images are affected by the individual lives and the cultures and the history of the time. So for example, the killing of Siegfried is an archetypal image. Archetypally, we can talk about the hero and the power of the hero and the power of that certainty, of that kind of decisiveness, of that kind of warrior. We might even want to talk about masculinity. But as in terms of it's being dialogical, then we're talking about Siegfried as Germanic, as to do with Jung's own cultural heritage, as connecting to the images of the young men dying in the First World War. We're talking about those specific historical and cultural things through which the archetype is manifest. This is a way of understanding, or it can be a way of understanding a book like the Red Book as existing in a field of archetypal powers that are manifest through particular instances. So these particular instances are the instances that surrounded Jung, his conscious and unconscious mind as he was composing the Red Book, but they are also the instances that surround us when we read the Red Book and when our own archetypes are invoked by the images that we're encountering in the Red Book itself. So, in the Red Book, it's not only about the death of Siegfried as the death of the hero, it then becomes a discussion about words and the meanings of words and what words are. And as we heard in the Izdubar exchange, where at one point Izdubar and I are talking about words having great power of poisoning, but words can also be empty. Words can be the words of the I figure's world are powerful in the sense of slaying Izdubar, but also empty and unsatisfying to the I figure. You'll notice that I'm not saying Jung, I'm saying the I figure. That is for two reasons. One is that I want to get away from the author-centered understanding of the Red Book, but also the I figure just is one of a dialogically animated group of characters. I is definitely not Jung in the sense of presenting a coherent character. What is fascinating in this sense, and I want to bring in Jung's distinction between signs and symbols. Because Jung distinguishes between signs and symbols by defining a sign as having a conscious, known, and hence stable meaning, while symbols, being charged by unconscious energy, offer possibilities of unknowable dimensions. Ultimately, one could call this a disciplinary and therefore a cultural question. Some types of writing are supposed to have stable and coherent meanings, such as science and the law, and in some people's minds, psychology, while other types of writing are expected to be playful and challenging, such as literature and poetry. So Jung's idea about the division between signs and symbols isn't just about different kinds of words. It also reminds us that we decide some language is about signs and some language is allowed to be symbols. But of course, symbols are very important in the Red Book, and we have the kind of famous exchange between Elijah and Salome and the eye figure on the symbols, where at one point Elijah says, "We are real and not symbols." And you kind of wonder what the word symbol means at that point. But much later on in the Red Book, there is the phrase, well, symbols are the way to salvation. So maybe there is a kind of reconstruction of what a symbol is, in that the many figures, the many characters in the Red Book, none of them is a real person in the sense of being presented as a real person. They are all seem to be flickering presences and absences in the way in which they both are and are not part of the psyche of the I figure. So if we take a figure like Ammonius the hermit, gives another portrayal of the tragic consequences of the drive to perfect secure meaning. Ammonius is stranded and tortured by the many meanings of words. He longs for a divine inner word, one that is holy because defended from limitless possibilities. Only a God can know all the possible meanings of words. And so Ammonius dreams of a word to protect him from the slippage of signifying. That word would be a protective God to him. Or, as is suggestively offered, that word would be, quote, protective magic against the daemons of unending. I suggest that to want to escape from the multiple possibilities in words is to try to escape from the psyche itself. The Red Book develops an interesting dialogue between images, words, and magic that is also part of its counterpointing of Christianity and its predecessors. In the section, the three prophecies, the soul is said to give war, magic, and religion. The enigmatic and powerful figure of Philemon emerges to embody rather than offer explaining words about magic. Indeed, magic appears to be anti-word in the silence of Philemon's teaching. Yet silence is potent when Philemon finally says that magic is the opposite of what one can know. It's not about understanding anything. So the adept in magic is one who unlearns reason, no longer insists upon a stable, coherent, knowable meaning to words. Rather, magic seems to be a way of integrating with the world that absorbs the creativity inherent in language when it is regarded as embodied and not limited to human utterances. For here, I is deemed by others to have learned magic from Philemon by being seen in his company. Also interacting meaningfully with figures not limited to the human is the essence of the Red Book, while its underlying purpose seems to be to unseat rational notions of reality. So the question of magic in the Red Book is fascinating because it's about not being told anything about it. They have an exchange on magic, and magic is about not knowing something. The I figure is told. So I'm not going to talk for very much longer, but I'll just summarize a couple of things. So another thing that seems to be going on in the Red Book is the replacing of God. Not so much the replacing of God, but placing God differently. Very much placing it within. We notice how much of the Christian ritual is almost diabolically restaged in the eating of the flesh of the child, a female child, this time. And the ending where the book currently ends in the three shades who've come back from Jerusalem having not found what they sought, and they're asking for blood. They're asking for that life of the body. And that resonant phrase, when they're asked for, an explanation is asked for, and what is returned, you did not live your animal. And certainly, there is no certainly in the Red Book, but in the Red Book there's a lot about living the animal, both in terms of the creatures of the Red Book not being limited to human figures, as well as the sense of the kind of physical assaults that the Red Book recalls. I'm very fond, for example, of the I figure being carted off to the madhouse. I mean, that's a great episode if you think of this man who wrote the book, not authored it, who was a psychiatrist who started his career, dealing with people who were in the Berkholsey Institute. That in this particular text, he's the one that gets carted off to the madhouse. It's called the madhouse, and he's amongst people who feel they are in hell. At this point, the I figure doesn't identify that he is in hell, but clearly some aspect of him is there. In the Red Book, hell is a particularly resonant term. Drawn from Jung's native Christianity, its identity with a place of torment after death is radically revised. For example, I encounters hell first of all in his sense of uniting movement in space with being. Travelling to hell is becoming hell. Here, in what seemed to be an empty desert, creatures are absorbed into I and change his form into a demonic predatory animal. Now I is both killer and victim in a union of opposites that makes no sense at all. Anticipating the following section of the murder of the hero, this one is named Splitting of the Spirit, a literally diabolic episode. Diabolic, of course, meaning rending in two, diabolic. Rending in two what should be united. Paradoxically, this splitting results in the unholy uniting of predator and prey. And we remember that at various times in the Red Book, the I figure is identified with Satan by other figures that he encounters. This doesn't mean that I is Satan, it just means that other people see him that way at that point. Of course, the most horrific, a particularly horrific episode is when in hell the I figure sees the tangle of bodies, relieved only by a maiden driving a fishing hook into the eye of the devil. In the next episode, a woman forces I to eat part of the flesh of a murdered girl child. First, the woman is the soul of the child, then announces herself as the soul of I. I concludes that God wants this intimacy. God wants this kind of horrific intimacy. I would prefer to be rational. Hell is a state of being forcibly identified with predatory violence in human nature. There seems to be no way from disassociating from evil here in the Red Book, because the soul herself cannot deal with hell without cruelty. She blinds the devil by fishing for him. So, you know, if you look at that episode where the soul is kind of attacking the devil, she does it by an action of horrible action of putting the hook into the eye. So what is that saying about the soul and evil? That the cruelty isn't separate in the devil, it's in the soul as well. Of course, the essential nature of the Red Book is that we remember its dialogical structure, in which the word of I cannot be taken as the ultimate truth of the text. In the section Nox Tertia, I is taken to a madhouse, proclaimed to be hell by some inmates. The soul insists that madness should be lived and incorporated into the psyche. Yet at this point, the so-called mad are being locked up. Of course, one resolution of hell is the beautiful image, which we can call a symbol, of the tree of life. Accepting the low, hell, at this moment in the book, hell inheres in words that drag up the underworld. I senses that by accepting what is underworld in himself, what begins the Red Book as the voice of the spirit of the depths, then the diabolic splitting can be healed. Accepting the low, and I think this is the low as in the lower class people, as well as the low as in the hellish part of himself. Accepting the low is to plant a seed in hell that becomes a tree of life, uniting the infernal regions to heaven. So, just to kind of summarize and move on, I think we should remember that the Red Book, as well as containing these amazing voices identified with figures such as Izdibar and the Red One, it also contains amazing types of writing without being faithful to any one type itself. So we have all the different kinds of language that evoke the Bible. We have the humour. I've always felt that Jung's humour is undervalued, and in fact it's hugely important. That for Jung, humour is an essential and largely healing force, and certainly the humour is very apparent in the Red Book. We have the fairy tale of the king and the jar of otter lard late on in the book. We have parts of it structured in very dialogical form, recalling the mystery play itself. We have a kind of romance novel style of the castle in the forest and the girl whom he doesn't respect a great deal. And we have the whole form of the Red Book as a medieval manuscript, which of course is hugely important. There's a quotation in Psychology and Alchemy that I like very much, which talks about carnival. The carnivals of the medieval period were, he thinks, an essential source of psychic wholeness. They allowed a kind of an exploration, an incarnation of more of the psyche than was traditionally allowed in their societies. So this was where the mystery plays were performed, and the mystery plays were part of that carnival atmosphere, a time of feasting, a time of dancing, a time of playing jokes, a time of taking even into the religion some of these aspects in the performances of the mystery plays. And Jung says, well, after closing the carnivals, what we were really doing by shutting down the carnivals was opening the gates of hell. That the psyche needs some way of expressing and living out the bodily, the sexual, the irrational, even the poetic and artistic, in a way that is not just about our personal psyches, but also about our society, our collective psyches. And he seems to be suggesting that some of the violence of modernity, perhaps particularly in his own time, is to do with that cultural psychic repression of the other. I'm going to just finish by trying to sum up a lot of what I've been saying in saying that I'm talking about going beyond monotheism as it has been condensed into the building of rational Western modernity. There is an alternative to monotheism which is certainly embodied and incarnated in many non-Western cultures. And I'm going to call this alternative animism, even though I'm not suggesting that it's, I'm suggesting this is just a description of a certain type of psychic and religious organization. In animism, animism is the idea that not only is the earth sacred, but it's sacred in a multiplicity of forms. Animistic religions believe that there is a spirit in the river, there is a spirit in the rock, there is a spirit in the tree, and there are the earth consists of a multitude of spirits that are capable, in certain circumstances, of interacting meaningfully with human beings. If you have the right frame, if you have the right way of being sensitive to the field in which the other will speak. I see in Jung's writing a dialogue between ideas of a oneness of meaning and rational meaning and an animistic dispersal of meaning, and an animism of many voices, many possibilities. So the Red Book may not be amenable to one overall explanation. It may be that here we have a particularly animistic version of Jung's writing, though I think these qualities are perceptible in all of his writings, and that maybe the Red Book is a very potent psychological and artistic field by which we can treat ourselves, by which the culture can treat itself of its adherence to very narrow and limited ways of understanding itself and the psyche. So that's why I want to save Jung from the Red Book. I want to save Jung from any limiting of the possibilities of the imagination that he celebrates by any oneness of meaning constructed in the Red Book. And I want to save the Red Book from Jung from having a father god attributed to it, because, to be honest, I don't think he wholly believed in that kind of father god. So I'm going to stop now and invite questions and comments from the audience. Yes, Alexandra. Yes, I think that's a very good point. The fact that the Red Book is a bestseller is suggesting that it is if it is a bomb, then it's a bomb that has exploded and may be working silently throughout the population and may not be being felt most obviously in the psychology field. I think that's a very good point. I think that would be very interesting. I'm reminded of neutron bombs, which were supposedly silent and they went off and they left the building standing and they killed the people. I may be misnaming these bombs. So maybe, I do think it's rather symptomatic that we have a bomb image here. You know, it's kind of good if you want to kind of explode things, but on the other hand, exploding things can kill people. So there's a kind of, it's a very apt image given what's been going on in our 21st century world, and maybe it points to more than you initially meant to suggest.
I think you made a really important bridge between bringing back the active imagination of the alchemists and the split between science and art.
Yeah.
And that, for me, you opened up the road to a living nature through the psyche that isn't split anymore by bringing us back to unity.
Yeah.
And that to me is the complementarity of the bridge that brings it back rather than destroys it.
Thank you. Yes, we've had a point about active imagination bridging psychology and literature as being part of a general and much needed bridging between science and art. And to me, it seems so important that Jung's writing as a whole, not limited to the Red Book, is actually undoing the boundaries between science and art, revealing the boundaries between science and art as cultural rather than innate and intrinsic. And I think that's very important. Yes?
You mentioned at the beginning that Jung's vision of God and the divine is more immanent.
Yes.
And how do you see that in his writing, this opening, transcendent discovery journey, the soul in a kind of a more pagan, errant, in exile, going in search, coming to the God within.
Yes.
In the end, we are looking for the God within, not something supernatural, but within. How was that presented?
Thank you very much for a really important question. The question is about Jung seeing God as immanent rather than transcendent. I think, in a sense, one can approach the Red Book as being dedicated to, as I was saying, replacing God as inside, and also as actually undoing boundaries between inside and outside. But the kind of stress on the body in the Red Book and the psyche as being connected to the life of the body, life of the psyche being an embodied life, I think is hugely important. But to put it another way, that I think Jung's writing is itself dedicated to reconfiguring immanence, and by having these many voices, we see many voices in the Red Book, but we also see many voices in the writing in the collected works. And I think that this is an expression of an embodied, immanent, archetypal, multiplicitous, plural psyche. So that in the many voices of the writing, we have the immanent and beyond rational qualities of the divine spirit. And that's really what I was arguing in my book, Jung as a Writer, which was not about the Red Book at all, but about the collected works, which is that Jung is performing the psyche as an embodied archetypal psyche, and that he figures an immanent animistic divine through the multiplicity of voices in his writing. They are in dialogue between a possible oneness of meaning when it comes to concepts, but there's always a kind of there's a challenge to the oneness of meaning, as well as there is the possibility of figuring it. Thank you. Yes, Roxanne. That's a fascinating question. My colleague was suggesting that there may be two ways of reading, one metaphoric and one metonymic. I know, and suggesting that metaphoric might be a more oneness way of reading and metonymic might be more multiplicitous. The short answer is yes, I am suggesting metonymic way of reading, and metonymic means that you see an intrinsic connection between things, whereas a metaphor is a comparison of things that are not connected, not essentially connected. I know that there are many people, many scholars in the field that wouldn't agree that metaphor is dedicated to oneness, but I think the idea of the field and the idea of the frame and the idea of an embodied psyche is intrinsically metonymic. I think metonym is very important if we are thinking of ourselves as connected to the planet, as opposed to human beings being in some way separate from the world outside ourselves. So yes, I would see the metonymic structure as something that we should be aware of. Thank you. John.
Just a magnificent morning. I wanted to say one thing, that I wouldn't put all the blame on Sonu Shamdasani for the Genesis myth. I'm afraid it starts with Jung himself, and in that sense, rescuing the Red Book from Jung, and particularly the later Jung, because it was in the other book he was ambivalent about having published, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that he himself wrote these words that Sonu took very seriously in his project of let's talk about this as Jung saw it. He was the one who said everything else came out of these fantasies. That was the source of all my work. And that's the self-mythologizing of Jung, which in a way is against the spirit of the Red Book.
Yes.
It's sort of like having overcome himself, he starts later in life and creates this mythology out of which we've had so much Jungianism ever since. And in a way we have to save ourselves from reading it in Jung's self-mythologizing way, as the genesis of I discovered, etc.
Yeah. That's a really good point. John Beebe has just pointed out that Sonu Shamdasani's Genesis myth of the Red Book draws upon a particular passage from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in which Jung says, it all began then. These are the experiences upon which all my later work came, which is a fair point, except that Jung is talking about the experiences. He's not talking about the writing. What Sonu does is he collapses the experiences with the writing. The argument that the truth of the experience is going to be entirely and transmissible into the writing on the page, which is a perfectly reasonable argument. It's just not the only argument. It is the argument that says the truth of this experience can be taken from the psyche and put in the words, and there's no gap. And therefore the words will contain the truth of the experiences. Now that assumes that language itself is stable and true to experience. And all I'm saying is, while respecting the huge amount of work that Professor Shamdasani has done on the editing, I'm simply saying there is another way of construing the Red Book that doesn't rely on a notion of language as being transparent to experiential truth. Yes?
I haven't heard any mention of the possibility of Jung as a mystic. And we have the long mystical tradition in the West of the night journey, or hence of Assisi's stigmata, the violence going with the mystic union. And the mystics all felt this union with the divine.
Yes.
So could you comment on that?
Yes, the question was about the mystical tradition and the possibility of Jung as a mystic. I think there's a huge amount there because the mystical tradition itself doesn't regard language as fully rational or stable. So I think very much we could profitably see the Red Book in the mystical tradition, and that the mystical tradition may inform the whole of Jung's writings, because the mystical idea of the divine is very close to Jung's idea of the psyche. At this point, I'm going to just mention a question that was emailed to me by somebody who is going to be in the webinar, because he asked whether there was any relevance between the Red Book and narratives produced under the influence of psychedelic drugs. I think in a literal sense, probably not. I don't know of any kind of suggestion that that Jung actually took any such materials. But I do think there is a kind of generic interest there that, from what I've read of psychedelic experiences, they may be speaking to parts of the psyche that we are also getting in the Red Book, and that in some senses we may also get in some of the mystical writings. So in the sense that we're talking about different ways of using language, different non-conventional modes of the psyche, then yes, I do think there are resonances and resemblances that people might want to explore. I'm aware that we really should finish for lunch soon, so let's finish for lunch. We will start again in 55 minutes at 2 o'clock if people could be back by then. Thank you so much. So we're going to start in a minute. And for this part of the event, we're having a panel discussion. Each of my 3 distinguished colleagues will say something as much as they want, and then I will come in after each of them have had a chance to speak, and then we'll see how the dialogue goes from there. So we're both formal and wildly irrational at the same time. I think we'll start with this end.
Thanks, Susan, for another brilliant lecture, seminar. You really expanded our perspectives on the manual and on analytical psychology. So, and given us a lot of avenues for further inquiry. What I think Jungian analysts are beginning to realize as we're reading along with you is that he's someone we've come to know primarily through our study for Jungian analysis and doing Jungian analysis, is that he's larger and more far-seeing than we really could have appreciated from that perspective. And I especially like the invitation that we give special attention to Sandy Groves. The last chapter in his book, he invites us to psychology to open its borders to the humanities. I think the analytical psychology has always had porous borders. We draw people from many disciplines to immerse themselves in his work, from anthropologists, theologians, philosophers, professors in the humanities, and in the sciences of law and engineering as well, I think. But every one of them has had to adapt themselves to psychological language to become Jungian analysts, for the most part, to learn the analyst skills and to understand the boundaries, the limitations of an analytic practice. And that's been our primary focus at Medium, but I think there's a consequence of academicians like you and other scholars that our perceptions are really enlarged, and traffic over that border has been going both ways. We're having to learn new languages and appreciate what we can learn from other fields. And not only that, but I think that we Jungians ourselves, as members of a multidisciplinary, and realizing that we're really polyglot, that we're a tribe, we always have been. And so I think we reflected that diversity in overviewing some of the people who responded. The question about whether the Red Book is a bomb, I thought, perhaps it's not a bomb, but it's a poison. The same way science was a poison to culture and humanity, and that I think maybe centuries for the shift in consciousness and thinking to occur. But probably by that time, we won't even notice that it's happened, because it'll be the way things are. And I can't imagine what it would be like in that world. I'd also like to make a comment about your mentioning close reading. Those of you who are more interested in the subject, please buy our book. It's just been published. It will be out pretty soon. It's How and Why We Still Read Jung, Personal and Professional Reflections. And Susan's chapter there is Reading Jung for Magic, Active Imagination for or as Close Reading. So, I think the most enticing idea is that we are rewriting the Red Book as we read it, and as we write about it, and as we think about it, and integrate it. And I just have one more comment about Sonia Shamdasani's statement that his task is to reconstruct Jung's self-understanding, basically. That's the task of the biographer. And I do wish that we had a little greater understanding of the tasks of the psychologist, and had an appreciation of just how difficult it is to construct an understanding, a picture of a person's self-understanding, when that person is there to correct you. Invariably we're wrong when we try to do that. I think it's very humbling to be a psychologist. That's my comment.
Thank you very much, Jean. Tom?
First of all, I'd like, what I like to say first, I know what I want to say first. It says, I've heard, I can't tell you how many hundreds, maybe thousands of lectures on Jung. This is one of the most fabulous ones I've ever heard. So I just want to repeat that, and that what she has done with the Red Book has shown them with the multiplicity of voices and how we all started in the beginning, how dynamic the unconscious is, and in what way some of the people who've been writing about the Red Book miss that. Okay, that's all I'll say about that without getting into more details. Now, when I heard that the Red Book was coming out, and I'm going to be brief about this. I was against it And I said to myself, I don't want my personal diary published. And I think Jung had many opportunities to publish controversial things. For instance, when Answer to Job was first published in the United States, it was banned by the Christian something association, and you have to buy the book in England if you wanted to find it in English. And it was several years before the book was available in the United States. So I don't think Jung was shy about publishing controversial things. And as Sonu mentions in the introduction, Jung did show the Red Book to my father in 1929, and my father was a brand new student of analysis at the time. So he wasn't shy of showing the Red Book then. However, in 1954, my father wanted to see it again because he was writing in Jack London's The Red One, the last short story that Jack London wrote before he died. And at that time, Jung would not show him the Red Book. He said, "No, I won't show it to you." So obviously there was some change in his view of what the Red Book meant, and he would have shown it to my dad as an absolute neophyte, and then as a 25-year colleague would not show it to him. So I think that's a piece of evidence. It's important. Now, I mentioned it to Susan, and she told me to mention it publicly. World War I, actually, Jung was a little bit involved in World War I in two ways. One is when the war three ways. One is validated that he wasn't going psychotic with his image of the blood going all up to the Swiss Alps. But the second was that he was in Aberdeen, Scotland, where he'd given a paper when World War I started. So he had to get back to Switzerland, cross the channel, go to Amsterdam, take the train back to Zurich in the beginning of the war. And unfortunately, nothing happened. Secondly, in 1917, he was one of the things he had to do was yearly military service for the Swiss military, and he was stationed at Chateau d'Eu in the French part of Switzerland, and he ran an internment camp for British officers who had, for some reason, had come to neutral Switzerland, and he drew mandalas there every morning. So it was a very good. He had a good terms of service. So that was one other thing I wanted to say. I liked that Susan mentioned Sherlock Holmes as an imaginal figure, because one of the ways that Jung enjoyed kind of relaxing was reading detective stories. So
he was a big fan of Agatha Christie.
He was a big fan of Agatha Christie, right? So, he was very fond of the English, no question, just as I am. I think the way Susan presents the idea of a Genesis myth is very important, because if you look at this new edition of the reading version of the Red Book, the pages are like a Bible, like a New Testament. And they have the curved, rounded edges. And I can tell you more than one person has been upset, because that tends to do just what Susan doesn't want, which is that you take the words and make that the experience. And I don't know whose idea it was to publish it in this form rather than just a regular book. But I know that it has upset more than a few of my colleagues to have it out this way as a Bible. So I think that's what I'll say.
Thank you so much. It's interesting that you say that about the Bible form of the book. It's been said to me too. I wasn't aware that in the Jungian world this perception was also current. I think that's very interesting. Let me hand this over to Susan.
The first thing I want to say is that everybody draws the comparison between the Bible and Save Jung, but another comparison is to Dante's first book of poetry, which was the Vita Nuova, and he in there, in fact, employs the same type of way of talking about his experiences. He prints a poem, he then explains the form of it, and then he explains what it's all about and what it means to him. So, because this book was called the Liber Primus or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that what Jung had in mind in any way was that it was the first book of the Genesis. He was also reading Dante while he was doing the writing. And the actual comparative terms with Dante's first book of poetry are actually much clearer than they are with the Bible in terms of formal characteristics. I have only a draft of Susan's talk to work from, so there may be some repetitions in what I wrote, and it'll be slightly longer than my colleagues, but not very much. Okay. I want to first to just read the quote that Susan put into her paper on page 6, if I can get to it. This is a quote from Jung. Nobody drew the conclusion that if the subject of knowledge, the psyche, were in fact a veiled form of existence not immediately accessible to consciousness, then all our knowledge must be incomplete, and moreover to a degree that we cannot determine, and maybe never determine in that sense, because it's always on the move. This is the grounding of why the question of multiplicity that Susan was talking so much about earlier today is so important. This is where the grounding is of the unconscious is not a static entity. I want to thank Susan Rowland, and not only for being here today to lead us along certain trails she's traveled to approach the phenomenal mountain of the Red Book, but for encouraging all of us to begin to set out along our own trails towards it. The anticipation of its original publication toward the end of 2009 had something of the nature of a revelation of a mystery, perhaps of an access to some truth, even some kind of mystical truth. When opened, its readers found that it did not give up its secrets very easily. In her paper, Susan Rowland is suggesting that we approach this text as a text, rather than racking ourselves to dig out its most hidden and deepest and most singular meaning. Perhaps some might want to counter her use of a series of late 20th century techniques and concepts, collectively and loosely known as postmodernism, as inappropriate to an early 20th century text. But this would be to fall exactly into the trap that Rowland undid in 1968 in his seminal essay, The Death of the Author, as was quoted by Susan. In it, he means that death, to apply both to the author's text as being a kind of tissue woven from the many aspects of culture and experience the author has had contact with, none of them being the only center of the meaning of the text, but also, consequently, to the author's own being as having no single identity. Instead, the author is multiple. This replaces the idea of the trap, that if we can only get enough context about the author, we can understand and place both author and text in a prison of singular meaning. Susan also brings in the philosopher Derrida's methodology of deconstruction, which aims for the overturning of the practice of valuing one term of a pair of opposites as man, woman, heaven, hell, good, evil, not so that they can be reversed, which is one of the popular understandings of it, but so that they can be seen in interplay. It's perhaps unnecessary to reference Jung's ideas about the multiplicity of complexes in each one of us who do or have struggled to identify only with our egos, and the necessity of acknowledging consciously in ourselves the half of each pair of opposites that our culture struggles to repress or project. Susan Rowland amusingly calls this kind of postmodern theorizing the evil twin of Jungian psychology. But of course, she does this not only to make us smile, but because it points to what has made the contemporary world at large so destabilized. The realization that every entity, every thing that can be perceived either inwardly or outwardly has multiple meanings, both to the single practitioner and for single perceiver. We never step into the same river twice, and to the culture at large, which is made up of multiple perceivers. And secondly, that every word or group of words has multiple meanings, often making communication between people exceedingly difficult, and self-communication too. We can see Jung's attraction to the idea of single meaning and then his rejection of it in the Red Book character of the anchorite or hermit. I didn't know we're going to be talking about that, who reads only one text, attempting to decipher its singular meaning and never succeeding. It is no wonder he is imagined as living in an arid desert. The rest of the Red Book is Jung's progressive but agonizing letting go of this old ideal. An enormous cultural instance of this, Jung says specifically, is the splitting off of the body and the bodily in Christianity. It is startling to hear him actually address Christ in the Red Book with the words, you did not live your animal. As a result, singularity of meaning, called in other words, in this case, dogma, has led Western Christianity into an increasing conflict of the acceptable with the unacceptable. So, first, as there cannot be just one meaning to a word or a concept, we cannot just be an ego or just a persona without engendering enormous conflict within ourselves. One writer to whom Susan Rowland pays attention is Wolfgang Vigorous.
I don't know.
Giger.
Yeah, okay. He speaks of the two, what he calls moments of the psyche as subject and object, keeping them separate. But these words are not so neatly packaged in the psyche. The phenomenon of the counter-transference in clinical work reveals how these two modes are exchanged and mixed. To whom does a particular emotion in the consulting room belong? This is both a form of projection, but also a form of relating. If therapist and client can become conscious of the moves and shifts between them, even of a few of the moves and shifts between them. Here too, then, meanings are mobile, as they are in individuals and in their culture. Again, in a clinical example, we see the mobility in the way a dream, and we're all taught this in our training, a dream can be interpreted as meaning something both objectively and subjectively. It may be observed that all these examples are not occurring in a transcendent medium in the usual sense. Rowland mentions Van Nieuwenhof's argument that they are in an immanent medium, with an A, in some way embodied. So thanks to Susan Rowland, we have the possibility of approaching the Red Book without the desperate necessity of looking for its one real meaning. There remains, of course, the question of what form this might take. Perhaps her paper is a contribution to a shift in cultural attitude. Perhaps an openness on the part of the reader-writers to accept, according to their own perceptions, meaning in the various articles and books that are and will be written about the Red Book. Finding, again, from their or our own perceptions, the richness of multiple meanings, and even of perceived disorder, confusion, or chaos. There is also another word of hope. Words have always had another mode, that of poetry. As the most obvious example, it's almost impossible to read even a single line of Shakespeare without realizing that it can be interpreted in many, many different kinds of ways. Jung, I believe, was trying to save the possible coherence of the individual and the individual's perceptions and meaning-making in a world that had become destabilized. And after all, Jung's mode of saving the individual did not ask for integration of every complex and archetype, but a perception and acceptance of their realities as they found them, and a relationship to each one that was revealed, a relationship to each one that was revealed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there was so much in that that clarified things for me. So I want especially to thank you for that paper. One thing that Jung said was he invited people to make their own red books. And I guess what I've been arguing is that right now in this room, but also through the medium of technology, we're right now engaged in the process of making the red book. That by our own interaction, our own dialogue, and through the medium of technology, both through the webinar and what's going on in this room, that we're kind of coming together and making our own red book. It is this collective field of our imaginations responding to this very powerful text. I've tried to do this with my students in the sense of when they come to class, I invite them to make their own red books in terms of generating images and also of working in a group and taking those images into a ritual and a sense of kind of embodying a kind of imaginative co-participation in the unconscious, the world, the dreams that we all bring. I mentioned earlier the episode with the tramp who was deeply enamored of the cinema, and he wants to live in a town because towns have cinemas, and in cinemas you can see all of life, he says. And for example, he's seen someone carrying their head underneath their arm, and the eye figure reflects somebody carrying a head under their arm. That's very strange. But hang on a minute, didn't the saints do that? And in the image of the cinema, do we have another kind of portrayal of sainthood? And so there's this extraordinary comparison between a saint and the cinema of film in which this kind of thing can be portrayed. And something's going on about technology and the imagination. So I'd like to invite any kind of comment or question from the floor at this point, and then I'll invite my colleagues to come in to the discussion again. John.
Someone used to say that the Red Book is intensely cinematic. Yeah. And the moment when you walked into that room with the life and Salome and the wall in the back, is almost like a modern LED screen. I mean, there's something extraordinary about the cinematic quality. So I someday someone's going to make a truly great film. It has many of the qualities of contemporary cinema. The point of view is resolved. There are a lot of people are experimenting with the various forms that are in the cinema. It was sort of thrilling that the transit passed through. I was really impressed with that.
That's right. Jung doesn't talk very much about the cinema, which is a huge kind of feature of the age in which he's living. John Ph.D. has just pointed out the cinematic quality of the form of the Red Book, the way images kind of resolve, the way you have these different points of view. In a way, you could even suggest that a cinematic age is going to encourage the kind of flow that you get in the Red Book and the kind of mutability between different characters and how they are both, they seem to be kind of different people, and then they're not really that different. They seem to be kind of speaking out of some connection to the other, and how the soul is a serpent and a bird and a woman, and all the women are one woman, but they're also all different. There's something intensely modern in the cinematic quality of that. Can I invite either of you to either respond to anything you've said or to introduce something?
You mentioned, and this connects to the idea of cinema and what's so popular today. I was thinking about the Red Book as also being the genre of fantasy literature, which has become immensely popular in the past 50, 60 years. Although it had its roots back in the 19th century, it was given a forward thrust by Tolkien with the Lord of the Rings series and The Hobbit. And he was beginning to write that about the same time Jung was writing the Red Book. It's intriguing to think of there being a field of unconsciousness that was operating, that embraced both Tolkien and Jung in this period. But one of the qualities that Jung had that's very prominent in fantasy literature is nostalgia, and longing for an earlier age. And Jung always, or said numerous times, that he was a medieval man. And he harked back to that period because it was a time when secular and spiritual powers were equalized. One didn't have a hegemony over the other. As today, where spiritual power has gone into an eclipse, or gone behind the scenes anyway, and appears in places like the cinema, like fantasy literature.
Well, I'm completely out of my depth when it comes to cinema, but when I was watching The Life of Pi, I had my associations with the Red Book. Yeah, look at the, yeah, look at the other thought, another thing I wanted to mention is that in 1957, a man named Richard Evans, a professor of psychology in Houston, did a whole series of, I'm not sure how many hours, maybe 4 or 6 hours on Jung. And one of the themes was about what Jung thought about psychedelic drugs and tranquilizers and all that. And he was quite against the psychedelic drugs in that interview.
That was very responsible of him. Yeah, I think Jim is definitely onto something in the bringing in the Lord of the Rings. Again, there is a very kind of fascinating treatment of the heroic attitude and a kind of reinvention of what heroism might mean in terms of kind of vulnerable and the need for the warrior figure to be decentered and the need to kind of come to terms with evil. And so, indeed, I think there is something kind of going on in the early 20th century in which part of it is a sense that an earlier age had a kind of wholeness of psyche that somehow has been lost to Western civilization. And clearly there's so much that can be said about the Red Book's form as a handwritten manuscript with these amazing paintings, also drawing on different styles, also drawing on different cultures. And you know, the Asheville Jung seminars, there was a very valuable one recently on different cultural images and traditions in the Red Book. So there's something about a kind of largeness of spirit that seems to be not accessible in the Red Book unless we kind of evoke an earlier age. And one of the things about medieval literature is it was one of the last periods of art in which painting and words could go together in a way that stopped being possible once printing came in and books were printed, and so they weren't handwritten anymore, so there wasn't that opportunity for individual painting and illustrations. So there was a lost sense of that connection between different types of images, word images and painting, visual, fine art images. And one of the things that's happening today is with the resources of cinema and now with the internet, it's possible for artists, filmmakers and artists on the web to use images and words and sound and movement in a way that some of which was possible in medieval illustrated books, but in some senses was lost since the very early theories of European art. I'm talking about cave paintings. That in the cave paintings, and there was a wonderful recent film about that, Cave of Forgotten Dreams. In the cave paintings, it's now considered that they were not simply the paintings, they were a kind of multimedia, artistic, religious, sacred experience in which there were images that may well have been moving because of the flickering of the torchlights, that there may have been music, there may have been dance, there may have been storytelling. Musical instruments have been discovered in the caves next to the paintings, very, very, very ancient musical instruments. So that kind of multiple possibilities of the imagination has happened in various cultures in various times. It happens now in many non-Western cultures that have that tradition associated with their religions. It's it's us that live in a world that's created a world in which we've separated art and religion and science and psychology into these different things. And there may have been great gains from this, but maybe the Red Book seems to be trying to enact a criticism of this separation into different psychic modes. And I think that's something that you were getting at, Susan.
Yeah, I think that I like Don's comment because it is sort of putting together what an idea that Wagner had of with the Sammelbewerk and the everything all put together work, and it has been achieved in the cinema, and for the first time. Jung wanted to go back. He said twice in the Red Book very specifically, he wants to go back, we have to go back to the medieval, we have to do this. But then the chapter that he writes about going back to the very early days of Christianity, the beginning of the medieval with the anchorite, was critical. He spends a few days there and realizes that in fact what came out of that was a pernicious kind of unity that would be reflected in the early councils of the church where dogma was set, and that was what one was required to believe and not to respond to. And he's talking about responding to something, not believing in it. And so we now do have this opportunity for a put together work again, which is very nice if we find the right ways to do that instead of having it too much corrupted by the marketplace and what some focus group or group of focus groups has decided will make the most money.
Thank you. There were a couple of people over here. Yes, sir.
I'm very interested in when you said how we can make our own Red Book. And you said you recommend this for your students, but we are developing, I'm in psychology, mental health, and we are developing storytelling for the elderly, and narratives that integrate their lives. And I'm also interested in my own. You know, everybody has his own autobiography or his own memoirs. How the Red Book can help us in that stage of our life to integrate all these voices, all these teachers? Can you give us some?
The question was incredibly rich one about if we can, if the Red Book is something we should be making, how does this particular Red Book encourage us to make our own Red Books as we try to perhaps not copy Jung, but imitate Jung in terms of trying to integrate our own souls and our own stories. The Red Book that we have that we read is, I've been arguing, is very personal and very collective. Very personal in terms of Jung's own particular religious situation and struggles with things like the feminine, things like a world at war. I think we have to dig deep into our personal crises, and then we'll find that we are also in the collective psyche. So what I encourage my students to do is to be in the place that they are in, that we are in at that time, and to find an image that arises for them, and to work with that image, and then to join up with the people around them and work in a group with that image. And eventually we build up, through this individual kind of generating of an image, we build up a ritual which in time could be developed into a story, into a myth. And I take this as in some sense, a profoundly Jungian idea of working with the images and through something that could be called active imagination, this kind of dialogue with an image that is coming from the unconscious, coming from the dream, coming from the imagination, and that dialogue co-creating with the image a kind of a movement, a story, a kind of expression, the way the image might want to express itself. These days, it might not be a medieval manuscript type book. It might be working on a web page. It might be writing stories out of dreams. But if it's going to be a kind of red book, it's probably going to be starting with the deepest material we can bear and seeing where that leads us. But I think this is not my own area of expertise. I think that perhaps analysts and therapists are frequently co-creating red books with their patients out of the work with the very deep material that comes up.
I can do that. I get the drift. At the Library of Congress workshop on the Red Book in 2010, when part of what I said in my paper there was that that Jung has given us a model for the Red Book, for individuation. But I think he would be very disappointed if any of us took that as that we should, draw mandalas the way he did and have in the sense of the imitation of Christ that we do an imitation of Jung, but that we have. That the important thing is to find our own way of individuation. And I can certainly say that I'm in my 70s, and there's no way that I'm doing what you did in the 70s.
Strangely, what comes to mind is a movie, the title of which I can't quite remember. It was Julia and Julia, about the young woman named Julia who decided that she was going to start a blog and make every recipe that Julia Childs had made. And that's a form of thinking a Red Book. I think there was some other questions.
Yes.
Bonnie.
And I think, in some ways, I can see that really making our food ritual was a way of keeping that carnival. Was the carnival a place where you go and have all those parts of yourself? And, and also a way of avoiding those rituals as we know we cultivate that time. So I wonder if we perceive that making our own red book, however we go about doing that, might also be a way for us to collectively manage those things out and what has broken.
Thank you very much. Yes, the comment was about the quote, the new quote that I quoted previously about the carnival being the alternative to the gates of hell, and that the Red Book was a kind of carnival to Jung, and that what we're being asked to do is to find a way of having a carnival that will help us to close the gates of hell, or at any rate limit the possibility of hell developing further. And I think that's absolutely right. I think that what we have in the Red Book is a kind of carnival in the expressions of the imagination. We have so much multiplicity of of voices and forms, that it is a kind of carnival itself, and that we're being invited to find our own forms of carnival, which may look quite differently in the 21st century, in the world in which we find ourselves. But the important thing is to have that way of managing all the possibilities of the psyche in ways that can be fruitful, fertile, funny, and therefore not constellate the gates of hell is that repression of so much. And the more you repress it, the darker it gets. And until you find that you fall into hell and you become hell, as the Red Book so memorably and powerfully shows.
I want to deeply thank my fellow panelists and colleagues and friends, Susan Thackeray in particular, for the deeply thought and worked out ideas and arguments that definitely add to my own approach to the Red Book, and from which I've learned a good deal today. I'm so grateful to Jean and Tom Kirsch for their kindness, their hospitality, and by bringing their lifetime of wisdom, experience and scholarship to discussing the Red Book with us today. I think all four of us share the sense that, in Sanford Drope's excellent phrase, that the Red Book is a multifaceted text, and that one of its gifts to our time is to liberate and explore the things that haunt us, and the ways in which we can deal with suffering and violence in our world today, ways in which we can approach these things imaginatively, compassionately, and maybe find our way to do things better. I think we're all struck by the way the Red Book, originally composed 100 years ago by a man in Europe, very much of his time and very much suffering some of the pains of his time, is also a text that seems to have brought itself to birth in the 21st century in ways that are deeply resonant for us today. We are still struggling with war and religion and our own capacities for violence and cruelty. We are still suffering from our inability to make relationships that are healing and sustaining. And the Red Book seems to be an attempt to kind of explore, enact, and provide this kind of mystery play which we can all take part of in, and we can all, to a certain extent, adapt as we go through our own lives. So I want to just take the last few minutes here to kind of sum up some of the approaches of today, to draw the threads together. So we've been talking about the characters of the Red Book. And the characters are, of course, the many voices of the Red Book, but they're not the only source of the many voices. Another source that we've touched on are the different literary genres, as well as the mystery play, the liturgical language, the cadences of the Bible and the Psalms, the dramatic encounters. There are novelistic tones of romance novels in The Castle in the Forest, dream stories reminiscent of medieval literature, ghost stories, a fairy tale of the King and the Jar of Otterfat, the Madhouse episode, and of course the whole form of the Red Book as an illuminated medieval manuscript. While there is material here for many book-length studies of the literary ingredients of the Red Book, one evident quality is its opening to the collective culture, the collective imagination, through the use of multiple recognizable genres. We recognize parts of our world in the different kinds of writing in the Red Book. The Red Book quests for a wholeness of modern psyche by dramatizing voices that are psychic qualities or their traditional forms, such as religious language, romances and fairy tales. These genres are collective structures crafted from imagination's needs and moulded anew to adapt to social and psychic changes. By weaving together characters not limited to human beings and genres not limited to those culturally designated psychology, the Red Book strives to embody more psyche than is usually permitted in psychology. In fact, the defeat of Izdubar could be seen as the vanquishing of the other to modern rational ways of knowing. Of course, it's important that in the Red Book, the defeat of Izdubar is not the end, that Izdubar actually comes back and is really quite cheerful. Crucially, I'm suggesting that the Red Book does not offer one voice or image as the one meaning or symbol for all of it. Over-meaning is not singleness of meaning. It is rather a term that advertises its clumsiness to deny such a possibility. A lot comes down to symbols and the debate within the Red Book about their reality. In asserting his and Salome's reality, Elijah says that calling them symbols does not invalidate their status as being as real as other people. After this conversation, I reflects that symbols are transforming. He sinks into a symbol in order to change from my one into my other, so asserting the many voices of the Red Book as those of Psyche. Put another way, the Red Book as carnival and mystery play is vitally animistic. Whereas privileged rational genres of modernity strive for coherence in the multiple possibilities of words and hence monotheistic oneness of meaning, the Red Book is letting loose the many voices of its genres and creatures. Animism is used here to mean a religious and psychic system of many voices that exist in dialogue without any one dominant spirit. Animism is a key mode of Earth Mother consciousness that bases consciousness on connection, embodiment, sexuality, and being part of non-human nature, not separated from it. In this sense, the Red Book's enactment of past and present cultural forms as diverse is also its connection to the other as non-human nature. Earth Mother sees language as not exclusively a human property, and as connecting us to the living power of the planet. So the Red Book is a form of writing to restore our vitality in reconnecting to the animistic voices of human and non-human nature. One important way it does so is by its treatment of time as both linear and circular, by introducing the voices of the dead to the way of what is to come. Late in the Red Book, 3 dead shades approach, and Philemon eventually delivers to them 7 sermons to the dead. Even at this point, the many voices of the Red Book do not agree. And this is, again, part of us, the way in which we should remember that this is not a book that's going to even end with giving us the solution to its many voices, that they are going to continue to be liberated in the imagination of the reader. The Red Book's many voices point forward to a creative complexity in the mind of the reader. It offers no single or coherent meaning. Even its over-meaning is animistic in its multiple capacities to incorporate the irrational. The Red Book summons the dead in the dying voices of our age. The breathing reader gives them blood, as the Red Book assists us in facing the war-torn and ecological wastelands of the 21st century. And here we end the webinar, and I thank everybody who's taken part, both here in San Francisco and wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for being part of this event.